Welcome back! My name is Baller Scuba, and this is Video Games Over Time. We have made it to the end of 1979. We've made it to the end of the 70s. And as a result, we're going to take a little bit of a retrospective here. We're going to look over what we have done so far. It's going to be a little bit more relaxed of a video. I don't necessarily have a script in front of me, but I do have some talking points that I wanted to cover today. So let's kind of get into the 70s. It's a little bit of a celebration today. I don't have any special guests, unless my dog wants to get into the video, but she rarely actually does. But let's talk about the 70s. Let's talk about the channel. Let's talk about the project. There have been quite a few developments in the 70s that are worth going over, kind of taking a step back and looking at everything as a whole. We'll start with some behind the scenes stuff for the channel. I do have notes. They're right there. So when I'm looking there, that's what I'm doing. This is something that has been an idea for years, doing what I am doing now. Sorry, I had something in my eye. Doing this kind of content has been something that I've been thinking about for a long time, trying to do stuff in chronological order. If you have been a fan of my channel for a while, you will know that when I was doing the Let's Plays, I started really kind of focusing in on trying to do things in chronological order, play the games in the order in which they came out so that I could see the development over time. I was, of course, always trying to do this with the franchises, so I would stay with Mario and I would play Mario games in that order. If I was doing Zelda, I would start with the original Zelda and kind of move on from there, kind of playing the games in chronological order. But then it started getting to the point where things were starting to meld together, and it was difficult for me to really do things in the order that I wanted. Right? For instance, it didn't feel right for me to play Super Smash Brothers without playing the games that each of the characters came from beforehand. It didn't feel right. Something that I got requested a lot was Dark Cloud. It didn't feel right for me to play Dark Cloud without playing really Ocarina of Time first. So it became kind of weird for me to kind of gauge what was next on my list. And so this kind of project really helped me kind of focus on doing things in the order in which they came out, and sticking to that schedule really did help me kind of sort out what I had always wanted to do. So it was easier for me to kind of go through this project once I got things rolling, but we'll talk a little bit about that later on. In terms of inspirations for me, I do talk about inspirations for other people on the channel. It's only fair to talk about mine. I was influenced by completionist Let's Players, same as I've always been. I am a completionist Let's Player most of the time, so it only makes sense for me to draw inspiration from them. Then there are always the retro video game players and the players that do want to play things in chronological order. I only really know about two channels that really kind of focused on that. One is Crontendo, where he's going through kind of the late 80s and early 90s of video games. And he's playing all the video games for a given console at a time. So he's playing every Nintendo Entertainment System game in order. Then he's playing every Sega Master System game in order. And then he's playing every TurboGrafx game in order. That's not how I wanted to do it. I didn't want to do every game, right? That seems like a tall task and one that probably will drive me nuts. So instead, I just kind of wanted to not focus on a single console. I wanted to do all of video game history so that you could see the development over time as it happened. That's one channel that kind of does something similar to what I do, and I would recommend checking him out. He's fun. If you're interested in that kind of development, he does show it. He doesn't just tell you that Mario was a groundbreaking game. He shows you this is what it was like before the game came out. This is what it was like after the game came out. So that is something that was a big inspiration for me. The other one would be the Video Game Years. They stopped making those videos a while ago, unfortunately, but they made it through the 80s, right? They did videos on the 70s and videos on the 80s, and, you know, that is also something that I enjoyed. that was something that I'm really looking forward to, hoping for more content from them, but it doesn't seem like that's likely at this point. But they basically did kind of an I Love the 80s style show, highly edited, high production values, with some big names in the industry, at least in the YouTube industry, of retro video gamers, talking about some of the games that came out that year, and they were doing it in order. That was also a big inspiration for me. And I would recommend seeing those videos if you have not seen them already. I would say checking out the channel, but there's not much there. Just watch the playlist of the videos. That'll be good for you. So yeah, there were definitely some big inspirations for me. This is not necessarily the most original idea ever, but it's something that nobody has really done the way that I would want it done. So that's kind of what I'm doing. So that's basically the idea of the channel. Let's see, what do I have here? Oh yeah, there were obstacles every step of the way. Every step of the way, there were issues with trying to get things scripted. That was something that was difficult. One of the things that I do want to talk about, yeah, I'm skipping a couple of my own lines here. One of the things I want to talk about was kind of where I decided to start. One of the things I really wanted to focus on was the actual video games themselves, and I didn't want to linger too long on everything else. But everything else is important. Putting things in their context is kind of one of the goals of the channel. So trying to focus on where I can talk about what's going on in the world and what's going on in other media while trying to get to video games quickly proved to be kind of an interesting concept, and something that was a bit of a struggle at the beginning, but is something that I was able to hopefully work out a good balance for. I'm sure there are going to be some people that felt I talked too much about, TV shows and movies and stuff like that, and didn't get to video games very quickly, while other people are going to say I didn't talk about that kind of stuff enough. But I think I struck a good balance when I was talking about that. Another obstacle was graphics. Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. I ended up going through 4 different graphics people, and I paid all 4 of them. They were all paid people. I had to think about it for a second. The issue was that nobody really wanted to do what I wanted them to do. The first guy that I went through, nice kid, I'm going to say kid, I saw a picture, he seemed young. He gave me a ton of effort, and I did thank him for that, paid him the full price and everything, just said, sorry, this is not what I wanted at all. He basically told, just kind of a quick one, because I don't have the assets anymore. We'll talk about that a little bit more later too. But he gave me a whole bunch of stuff. He gave me a background, he gave me an intro, he gave me an outro, he gave me a logo. None of it was what I asked for. I asked for something very similar to what I have now. I wanted the letters V, G, line, T, right? It's kind of a pun. Video games over time, right? That's the way that I thought about it. And he told me that having the 3 letters in a line would be far too busy for a logo. And instead of telling me that before he started working on it, he kind of just gave me all this work that he put a ton of effort into, and then told me that my ideas were bad, and that he wasn't going to do them. I told him that I wanted somewhere between a 5 to 10 second intro. I really wanted it under 5 seconds, but I figured, 5 seconds is going to be fine. And I wanted a 5 to 10 second outro. He ended up giving me a short intro that was nothing but a loading screen. And that lasted about 2.5 seconds. And I said, well, okay, I do want, the channel name on there somewhere. It just said loading. And then once it went through, it swiped off the screen and then you moved on. And hopefully you guys didn't hear that. I hit the mic a little bit. No, it seems fine. So he gave me that, and I was like, okay, that's close to what I want. I can kind of work with this. And then he sent me a 35-second introduction, which was awesome, don't get me wrong, but there was no way that I was going to play a 35-second introduction before each and every one of these videos. It just didn't make sense. So it was cool, but yeah, I ended up abandoning that and telling him I can't use really any of this. It was a really cool introduction. It was hard to find my channel name in there, though. Like I said, he did great work, just not what I wanted. And then the logo, he sent me a heart. It was just a heart on a blue background. And it didn't even look like a video game heart to me. It looked like it was pixelated, but it looked more like a Valentine heart than a video game heart. So I ended up telling him no for that too. Then I moved on, and I can't remember what the second person did. I think they flat out just kind of told me no, and gave me something that was a copy paste of something they had done previously. And then the third person that I went through was a friend of Hannah's. And so that was the one that actually worked out the best, and I would highly recommend checking out her. Her name's Natalie Cervantes. I want to make sure I get this right. And I will link her Instagram in the description below. She's the one that actually made my logo and my background. Her skill set is not necessarily for video, it's for drawing, and she does do great work. And I'm very proud of what she was able to get me. She did the job excellently, and it was worth everything. So that was great. But now I had a logo and a background. I still needed the introduction and the outro. So I ended up turning to somebody else. They eventually got me what I wanted, which is what we have on the channel now. I did ask for very specific kinds of music along with that, and that's the part that I ended up adding myself. They didn't really meet the music part of what I was asking. But yeah, the first thing that they gave me for both of them were pretty bad, so I was able to kind of work with them until we got what we have now. The first introduction was actually hand-drawn, and it had a hand-drawn Mario kind of going away from the screen, kind of weaving really slowly, more like this. So yeah, I was able to finally get them to do what I wanted. I didn't think it was asking too much, but I was finally able to get the things that I wanted. I'm happy with the graphics. I'm happy with the intro and the outro now, but it took a long time for me to get there, and that's kind of the point of that story, I guess. Yeah, scripting took the longest. As I mentioned before, it was hard to kind of figure out how to organize everything that I wanted to talk about. As much as I wanted to do things chronologically, there's going to be times that I have to kind of skip around. The founding of certain companies is not going to mean anything until they release a game. So when they release the game, we'll have to take a few steps back and talk about kind of what has happened. We've already kind of done that a bit. But for the record, we've talked about Nintendo a little bit on the channel. They've released a couple consoles. They were responsible for dealing out the Magnavox Odyssey in Japan, but we haven't really delved into Nintendo all that much. We will once we actually play one of their games, which, spoiler, we're going to be playing some Nintendo games as we go through the channel, as we go through the years and all that kind of stuff. So we'll talk about it when we play our first game from Nintendo. We'll kind of give a whole backstory of the company. That's kind of how I ended up deciding to do it. So I can't stick strictly to the timeline, the way that I wanted, because it doesn't make sense that way. That's the bottom line. The weirdest one for me was to talk about video game inspirations, though. That one is the hardest thing. Those are kind of the special videos that I do on the side. The Star Wars video that I did, the Aliens video, the Star Trek video, where I kind of go on the side, kind of highlight this outside influence. Dungeons & Dragons would count for that, of course, as well. That isn't a video game, but needs to be talked about so that we can fully understand what's going on at the time. So those were the hardest. And I'll take Dungeons and Dragons as an example because it's a great example. It's really easy to go into a rabbit hole with this kind of stuff. That's the bottom line, and that's why I have to organize things the way that I do. Dungeons and Dragons takes a lot of inspiration from sources that video games also take inspiration from. You're talking mythology, especially Egyptian mythology, Greek mythology, kind of random European mythologies, and of course Tolkien. So let's take Tolkien as another example. So there was a part of me that felt that before I talked about Dungeons and Dragons, hi Ruby, I needed to talk about Tolkien. So then all of a sudden I'm thinking, okay, do I do a full Tolkien video before I talk about Dungeons and Dragons? But then as I start digging into Tolkien, right, Tolkien's, his mythology didn't come from nowhere. So then do I start talking about his inspirations, which are like Finnish mythology and other European mythologies, just not French. We might not talk about that, but he was not a big fan of the French. You can see it in how he writes his languages, just no French influence. But, do I start digging into all the different mythologies so that I can then talk about Tolkien, so that I can then talk about Dungeons and Dragons, so that I can then talk about Dungeons and Dragons games? It really starts adding up quickly. So the ultimate the way that I decided on doing this, the way that I decided on getting this done, is that I wanted to talk about the thing when it was important. I might reference it. I might point out certain things. For instance, I pointed out that the Silmarillion came out in, I think it was 1976 or so. It was in the 70s somewhere. I should know. It's my favorite book. But The Silmarillion is a Tolkien book, and it is huge to lore building as a whole. The Silmarillion really does influence so much about nerd culture, and I wanted to talk about it. I still want to talk about it, and we will talk about it. But at the time that it came out, I really only wanted to talk about it. It came out. And then we will reference it later and say, hey, it came out in whatever year it came out. I'm embarrassed that I don't remember what year it was. It was in the 70s, though. And we will talk about it in more detail when we get to a game that's kind of based on it directly. And that's what I ended up thinking, is that I'm going to talk about these big, important cultural events as we get to a game that's based on it. With Star Wars and Alien and Dungeons and Dragons, their influence is almost immediate. And with a lot of other media, it's not. So the Silmarillion, it's not immediate. As soon as the game comes out, it's not like there's going to be a ton of video games based on the book. But with Dungeons and Dragons, I think it's within the year that there's a game based on Dungeons and Dragons. With Alien, it is almost immediate again. And it's so influential and it's so important that it was worth talking about right then and there. So that's kind of where I ended up thinking about how to talk about these inspirations, is that when it's relevant to video games is when I'm going to start talking about it. So I didn't talk about Star Trek, for instance, even though it came out before Pong, right? It came out in the 60s. Pong came out in 72. I didn't talk about Star Trek until 1979 because that's when there was a game pretty much based on it. It's not a licensed game, right? We talked about it in Star Raiders, but it is heavily influenced by Star Trek. So that is when I decided to talk about Star Trek. And that's going to be how we deal with this kind of stuff moving forward. If it's relevant that year, I'll talk about it that year. If it's not relevant, then I'll mention that it came out, and then we'll circle back to it when it is more important. That's how I ended up having to do it in order to save myself from talking about literally the history of the world before we got to video games, right? Because there's a lot of video games based on historical events. So do I have to talk about, the American Civil War before I can talk about Pong? No, it just doesn't make sense to do it that way. So that's how I ended up getting to that point. Speaking of media, I kind of glanced at my next thing. Music is difficult. And that has a lot to do with YouTube. Just as a whole, YouTube is difficult to put music out there. My plan is to put video game music in the background of the video game videos. So when I talk about a game that has background music, I will play that background music in that video. The problem is that almost all the games that we've talked about so far don't have background music. And the ones that do, the background music is kind of annoying over the course of a long video where I'm just talking. So Space Invaders, for instance, it's got great background music for a video game, but for a YouTube video, it doesn't work. So I ended up avoiding that. I am finding some copyright-free music that I'm able to put in the background of these videos. How long have I been going? I've been going for a while. There's no way I can put a background song on this video, for instance. But I will try to find music where I can. That sounds like the era that it comes out. So to this point, we've only been doing the 70s. So I'm going to have 70s background music. That's just the way that it's going to go. As soon as we hit 1980, which is very soon, I will start playing 1980s music. And that's the way that's going to kind of go moving forward. I'm going to try to take the music of the time and put it in these background videos. Of course, if there's a game or a cultural thing like Star Trek or Star Wars, I'll try to take some music that sounds at least like that property, if not something from that property itself. But of course, YouTube makes that very difficult. In terms of the actual Billboard #1 songs, because I do want to put you guys kind of in the mindset of the year, YouTube doesn't really allow me to do what I wanted to do. I originally planned on playing little clips, little 5 to 10 second clips of every #1 Billboard song of the year. YouTube didn't like it. YouTube flagged it, blocked it in several countries. I believe that the first video that I did, which was 1972's Culture, I believe I uploaded it about 10 times, trying to make the music work as best as I could, trying to put those little clips in. I was told, and still am told, that YouTube will allow me up to 10 seconds of a clip of a song before they flag it. I got everything under 7 seconds, and it was still flagging things. So ultimately, I had to find a different way to do it, and that's why I link playlists. But the original plan was to let you actually hear a little bit of the song, to go, oh yeah, I know that song, and then we'd move on. Just enough to either make you recognize it, or at least give you a sense of what was popular at the time before moving on. I do feel that music is hugely important to all these media, not just video games, but television and movies. So I do want to give you guys a sense of the music of the time. It is influential, even if you might not see it immediately. But I can't. So I just gotta have to link stuff. Here's a Spotify playlist, here's a YouTube playlist. But the idea was to play, 5 to 10 second clips, usually of the chorus, so that you guys would get a sense of what the music of the time was. It just didn't work out. So that's that part of it. What's next on my list? Oh yeah, I almost forgot. So at one point during this, I believe it was sometime around 1977 or 1978, when what videos I was making. My hard drive failed on me. That was fun. That took me a couple weeks to recover from. I was able to get most of the assets that I needed back. because I had them saved somewhere else. I was able to save the scripts. Those were on Google Drive, so they're kind of held separately. But my main hard drive failed. No warning, no stuttering, nothing, just turned off. I took it into a couple different spots, hoping that they could repair it. You know, my stuff at home just wasn't working. I have, I forgot what they're technically called. I don't have a good name. I've heard them referred to as cradles, though. Basically, you can remove the hard drive, put it into this tool that turns it into a USB. And I have two of those because sometimes the one will work and sometimes the other will work. Neither one of them was working, so I took it into some people. They said they couldn't repair it. I sent it to a data recovery specialist, and they pretty much just said, no, it's gone. You cannot get it back. So I ended up getting a new hard drive, technically got upgrades, got backups that I'm running all the time to make sure this doesn't happen again. But yeah, that was fun. That was a couple weeks. My next note is about doing it this year. Doing it this year, it's had some good points and it's had some bad points. One of the bad points is ironic, is that it took me forever to get a haircut. Just one of those basic things that I didn't have to think about until I started doing this channel, doing this project, really, is that I never really had to think about my appearance whenever I recorded stuff. Now I do. I'm on camera. I don't necessarily care how I look, but I need to look decent. And my hair, the way that it was when I wanted to start recording, was not in a place where it needed to be. So I eventually was able to get an appointment like 2 weeks out, right? And I finally got it, and they messed it up. I asked for certain numbers. I think it was a 2 and a 6, and they gave me a 2 and a 3, which is why some of the early videos I have, it looks like I have a buzz cut. That was not the original plan. That's not how I normally, have my hair, but that was how I kind of had to do it because of all the stuff that's going on this year, which I'm told I'm not allowed to talk about, but I don't care. Because of quarantine, because of COVID, it was really difficult to get things started. Like, things were delayed a couple weeks because of it. Then after they messed up my hair, I kind of had to wait for it to grow back before I could start recording. I usually put, as you can see, gel in my hair. And I couldn't do that when I first started the video, so there's a lot of thumbnails of me that, I'm not particularly proud of, but that was what I looked like at the time. That was definitely one of the downsides. Some of the benefits is that it's really quiet. I'm in kind of a small little room here in the neighborhood, and most of the time it's pretty quiet, and I'm able to record a lot because there aren't people out in the streets. Hooray, more technical problems. I don't know where it stopped, but yeah, apparently I get a half hour before the camera just kind of turns off on me. What was I talking about? Oh, so I'll start with my neighbor. My neighbor is a contractor, and he's working on that house. So there's some nights that I come back and I just can't record. I am in Portland, and that means that it rains. Hopefully it's not raining too hard right now. I don't think it is, but occasionally that'll pick up on the mic. But yeah, doing things this year was it was a blessing and a curse, because of everything that's going on. It was difficult for certain aspects of it, and it was easier for other aspects of it. But for the most part, I would say it was probably a benefit that the knowledge that I couldn't go anywhere made me kind of sit down and focus and get things done. I was able to get things done faster than I originally thought. I don't know if I'll be able to keep up that pace, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So yeah, that's kind of some behind the scenes stuff that went on way longer than I thought it was going to. So let's talk about our next topic. Let me move the screen a little bit here. Personal experiences. So yeah, this is something that I do want to talk about more in detail. My personal experiences with the things that we've been talking about. I, of course, was not alive in the 70s. I don't know about it, of course, but I wasn't alive in the 70s. I was born in 86. We'll talk about that when we get to 86, but that's when I was born. So my memories of 1979 are very hazy. One thing that people kind of forget is that you're still introduced to these things. You still had your first introduction to Star Wars. You still had your first introduction to Dungeons and Dragons and to Star Trek. It's going to be harder the further back we go to kind of know when that happened. I don't know what my first experience with Star Wars was. I don't remember. It probably was when I was really young. But I don't think I fully watched the first movie until I was 12. It wasn't something that was popular with my family or friends at the time. We'll probably talk about that as we keep going. But my friends when I was younger were not video game players. They were not nerds. It was something that was deemed separate. So I didn't have a lot of exposure to a lot of the things that we're going to talk about. I kind of came to them all later. So that was Star Wars. I don't remember. I remember liking it. I still like it. It's a great movie. But I don't remember when I first saw it, or I don't have any necessarily personal childhood memories of watching it. I do remember Star Trek a little bit more. I remember a show. We'll talk about it more later, but basically I didn't really get an introduction to the original Star Trek until I was like 20. It just never came up, and it was hard to find. Nowadays, you can just kind of look things up on the internet. That was the first time that I ever went through the whole thing, was when Star Trek was launched on CBS's website, and you could watch all the episodes there. I binge watched the whole Star Trek, at least the original series. But before then, I didn't really have that much exposure to the original Star Trek shows. I had more exposure to the movies growing up, and I remember not liking the movies all that much as a whole, because I think the first one that I saw was number 4. I didn't watch a good one to start. So, my experience with Star Trek is, something that kind of grew for me over the years. Same with Star Wars. It was something that grew because of later things that happened as a result of those franchises. But the original stuff, it was hard for me to get into. So that's those two main ones. With Alien, I didn't watch that full Alien movie until I was a full adult. I did not watch it as a kid. That's something that I came to later, and I appreciate it more now than I ever would have when I was younger. And I think it was because it was a space horror movie, and I just didn't like horror growing up. So there was that. Dungeons and Dragons. I've had a couple requests to talk about Dungeons and Dragons more in detail. I don't have experience with Dungeons and Dragons, unfortunately. It's something that I really regret. But I don't see how it could have happened any differently. Like I said, growing up, I didn't have any nerd friends. And Dungeons and Dragons is hard to get going. Even now, I've been working on trying to get a Dungeons and Dragons group going for almost a year, maybe even a little longer, and I can't do it. Of course, right now that's because of quarantine and all that, but this is the third time that I've actively tried to get involved in a Dungeons and Dragons group, and we've never made it to our first session. It's always been halted at some point during character creation. It just seems like a lot of effort for a lot of people. And to try to get a group together of, 4 or so, that's how I always picture Dungeons and Dragons, as a group of 4. I can't seemingly get 4 people that are willing to put in a couple hours a week. to playing Dungeons and Dragons. So I don't have experience directly with Dungeons and Dragons. I do have experience with a knockoff of Dungeons and Dragons. I played a session of that with my cousin. It was a game called Toon. I wouldn't recommend it. It's basically Dungeons and Dragons in Roger Rabbit, that kind of thing, like Toontown, that kind of sense of what works and what doesn't work. And I enjoyed it then, and so I've been kind of trying to recreate that ever since, and I can't get it together because it relies on other people. And I'm not in charge of other people as much as I try. I don't try. So Dungeons and Dragons, unfortunately, when it comes to the actual game itself, I have not played a session. I've made it through character creation a couple times. Last couple times, I've been deemed to be the DM, even though I've never played before. But I've run role plays before, so that's not out of my wheelhouse at all. But that's kind of Dungeons and Dragons. I wish I had more. I still want to get more. Can't find a group. Not willing to work on my schedule, at least. We'll keep working at that, I guess. In terms of the video games of the time, most of them I haven't played, if I'm going to be honest. Pong, I'm sure I've played some form of Pong my whole life. Pong's kind of everywhere, and it's a small part, and it's not remarkable by today's standards. So it's hard to say when I first played Pong, or even the name of the Pong games that I might have played over the years. I've been playing something like Pong forever. So I really don't know with Pong. With Breakout, I've played upgrades of Breakout. This is the first time for this channel that I ever played the original Breakout. I did a couple practice runs, and then I played the game for the channel for this project. I've only played the upgraded versions of that, and the upgrade versions are so much better than the original Breakout. It's hard to go back, and yeah, that's that one. Moving on to the next one, Colossal Cave Adventure. I hadn't even heard of Colossal Cave Adventure until I started doing research for this project, and I went back and forth on whether I was even going to play it, because it just seemed like nobody remembered it. But as I continued going, I started seeing a lot of later games that I did know and I did like, saying that they drew heavy inspiration from Colossal Cave Adventure. So it felt wrong not to include it. And once I played it, I had a blast. That was a fun game. But yeah, that was the first time for the channel as well. That was my first time playing it. What's next? Space Invaders is next, I think. I think Space Invaders is next. I might have to look at a list here. Space Invaders, I'm sure I've played at some point. You know, there's not much to say about it. It's a game that has been everywhere, has been copied endlessly. I'm sure I played it, but, you know, in terms of memories, there's just not much. That's through 78, I believe. What is that? 1, 2, 3, 4? Yes, that's correct. I've been doing a lot of research on this. For 1979, I don't remember what we did first. I think we did Star Raiders first. That was another one that I almost didn't do. But so many other games said that this was such a huge inspiration for them that I figured it was worth trying out for myself. And then when I did it, I realized how good the game was and I needed to actually play it. So even though most people, I assume, haven't heard of Colossal Cave Adventure and Star Raiders, they were arguably the best games that I played in the 70s. So even if you haven't heard of them, I recommend checking those out. Those were great games. Galaxian is the only game, that's next on the list. Galaxian is the only game that I had actually previously played on the channel before. I haven't, once again, I don't know. It's one of those shooter games. There's going to be a lot of them. It's hard to remember each and every one, so I don't remember the first time that I played Galaxian, but I had actually played it for the channel. That was one of those kind of experiments that I was doing when I was still doing Let's Plays to try to play shooters in chronological order, and Galaxian was the first on my list. It should have been Space Invaders, not Star Raiders. It should have been Space Invaders. That was the first real space shooter, and I should have started there. And once I started realizing that kind of thing, that kind of led to the creation of this project. But Galaxian, I've played a few times, I'm sure. The upgrades are better, so those are the ones that I remember better. We'll talk about that more when we talk about those. Then there was Asteroids. Asteroids, I mentioned in that video that I had played growing up. That was one of the few older games that I actually had growing up, and we'll talk about that more when we get to that specific version of Asteroids, but it was Asteroids. It was full-on Asteroids. Growing up, I didn't know that there was an emergency button, but that's about it. I was good at Asteroids. I was able to clear the screen like 3 or 4 times when I was a kid. It was one of a set of arcade games that I had access to growing up. I have some memories of that. It's one that's forgotten. It's hard to think that it came out in 1979, considering what else came out in 1979, especially looking at like Star Raiders. Star Raiders and Asteroids came out at the same time? Yeah, that's weird. But I do have some memories of that one, just not too many. Then the final one is Adventure. This was my first time playing Adventure. Was for the channel. Once again, I have made it a point to, especially for the shorter games, to play through it myself first to make sure everything functions right, and that I know what I'm doing. But as time goes on, we're going to be able to do that less and less, especially some of these games that start getting into 20, 40-hour experiences. But for Adventure, this was my first time actually playing it. I had heard legends of Adventure forever, and so I knew that I was going to be playing it, but I didn't have an Atari growing up. I didn't have the Atari VCS, we're still calling it. I have to think about it almost every time I write it down in the script. It's the Atari VCS. It doesn't have any other name, I swear. So that's kind of my personal experience with the topics that we've talked about. We haven't really gotten into where my main fandom is yet, and we will get there. Like I mentioned before, The Silmarillion's my favorite book. When we get to Tolkien, I'll know some things. So we'll talk about that when we get there, but for now, it's nice, but these aren't my childhood experiences, and we will get there. But I want to pay service to people that did have these experiences growing up and do them justice. So I didn't want to skip ahead to, well, this is what I had growing up. That's not really the point of the channel. We're going to go through everything, and I want to give you kind of as best as I can the experience of having these as a kid, and what it would have been like at the time. It's kind of the point of the whole channel, or the whole project. I keep on confusing the two, but it's the point of the project. Next on the list, things to keep in mind. Right. The 70s are not that far from the 60s. I did not really talk about the 60s or what was going on in the 60s. I mentioned that the United States was still at war with Vietnam in 1972. I mentioned that the space race was still going on. The Cold War was still going on. But it's easy to forget that what happened in the 60s is still going to have huge relevance in the 70s. The fact that Apollo 11 landed in July 1969, of course, is still going to have ramifications in July 1972. And it kind of feeds into this idea of space being the main thing to look at in the 70s. Just because the number changes over doesn't mean that everything changes. And the 60s were a huge transformative decade, and it's easy to overlook that. You have the kind of counterculture movement. We call them hippies now. I'm not sure if that was a bad term at the time, but you have this sense of people coming out comedically that are different. I almost included that in the videos. The culture videos was the stand-up comedy of the time. But then I realized that there were only two people I wanted to talk about, and that was George Carlin and Richard Pryor. So I ended up skipping it. But those two came out very recently. They were still very controversial. In 1972, George Carlin was arrested for his cursing routine, the 7 words you can't say on television. He got arrested for that in 1972. It's still a very transformative time. One of the movies that I ended up talking about was a porn. One of the most popular movies of 1972, I think it was still 1972, was porn. And I chose not to address it, not to talk about that, just to mention it. I believe it was called Behind the Green Door. It was really hard for me to find footage of that in order to play it on the video at all. But yeah, that kind of thing is still going on. It's a different time. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about the culture, is to try to get that kind of thing going. So yeah, space is huge. Next on my list is to talk about the Civil Rights era. The Civil Rights era was not that long ago in 1972. Civil rights is in the 60s, and it's in the mid-60s. So by 1972, we're talking less than 10 years. It's now 2020. It's towards the end of 2020, but it's still 2020. Imagine 2010. That's how long ago the civil rights would have been at the time that we're talking about this. So when it comes to the people that are highly influential, it's easy to overlook the fact that there are no minorities that we have talked about so far. And I believe that I should talk about one person in particular. What he had done did not warrant a long, deep dive in the other videos, but it warrants at least mentioning. And his name, let me get this right. His name is Jerry Lawson. And he was the chief hardware engineer for the Fairchild Channel F. We talked a little bit about the Fairchild Channel F. It was the first home console to use full-on cartridges. That is a big technological advancement. Of course, the cartridges didn't come out of nowhere. My understanding is that the Odyssey doesn't count, even though they did have removable pieces of hardware that would change the game that would work. And that came out a couple years earlier. But the Fairchild Channel F had an actual cartridge. And my understanding, once again, is that that technology was purchased, but it was implemented by Jerry Lawson. And Jerry Lawson is African American, and he deserves to be mentioned for his contributions. And although it didn't warrant a deep dive during the main videos, I wanted to mention that now. His life doesn't necessarily involve video games too often. Fairchild, of course, did not stick around with video games, but his life is worth looking into. He's a hell of an engineer, and his life is worth remembering. So I recommend that you do look into him if you have the time. Yeah. All right. So let's move on to things that I learned. Things that I learned. The first one on the list is not a good one. How much lying worked in the 70s? Holy crap. We're following a few people around. Gary Gygax is one. He was one of the first ones that we mentioned, so that's why he comes to mind first. Gary Gygax lied. He cut out basically the real creator of Dungeons and Dragons, in my mind, out, and that would be Dave Arneson. But Gary Gygax was the one that founded the company, that published his sets of rules first, and therefore he was able to capitalize on Dungeons and Dragons. And it wasn't long before he kind of cut other people out. And that worked. The other one at the time is Nolan Bushnell. He flat out filed a patent with his partner that his partner had invented and cut the guy's name out. That worked. I mean, it worked. And then he ended up cutting the guy out of the company. And for a long time, people did not know the name Ted Dabney at all. And I'm kind of lucky to be able to talk about it now, because now I can talk about Ted Dabney and his contributions. When maybe 10 years ago, people would not have talked about that, and people would have talked about Nolan Bushnell kind of alone. So that kind of brings me to my next topic, which is this is the stuff that I've talked about is kind of true for the time. And as time goes on, things are going to change. There's going to be more information that comes out. There's going to be clarifications that come out. Should that happen and I find out about it one way or another, I will try to correct as I go. But what I'm able to find now, I'm not 100% sure on. And I don't think anybody really can be. Especially in the case of like Nolan Bushnell and Atari. There was a lot of drugs going on at Atari. And there was a lot of parties going on at Atari, we'll put it that way. There's a reason that they named their consoles after the receptionists. But as a result, it's hard to kind of gauge whether what people are saying is true. And as a result, I've kind of stuck away from quotes that I can't find literal clips of people themselves saying that. Especially considering, like I said before, how much lying seems to work in the 70s. And then there's Steve Jobs. Speaking of lying, wow. It's already bad, what we have talked about so far, the relationship between Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. It's not going to get better. It's hard to sometimes separate the achievement from some of the personality traits. And Steve Jobs is probably one of the worst ones at that. We haven't really talked about him in a glorifying sense. And I'm not sure how or if that's going to change as time goes on. But that's one of the things that stands out to me of the 70s is you have these pairs of people. You have Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. You have Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. You have Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. And to a lesser extent, you have Bill Gates and I can't even remember the other guy's name. And one person kind of takes control of all four of those pairs. And it's hard not to see it as taking advantage at some point. And of the things that we've talked about so far, there's definitely some taking advantage going on. So yeah, that's that. I would say that the salesmen and the executives get way too much credit. And I'm happy to report that in 1979 that Activision was the first kind of step away from that. The programmers themselves wanted credit for the games that they made. And they left Atari because they weren't getting that credit and formed their own company called Activision. Because it was Atari, we talked about the creation of Activision. They haven't released a game as of 1979, but they will. And we'll talk about Activision some more later. So that's definitely something that I learned. Another thing would be the difference between platforms. It's so stark and it's so early on to see. How long have I been going? It's about to cut out again, but I'm prepared this time. It's stark to see the difference between an arcade game versus a computer game versus a home console game. And those are three like genres almost all to themselves. You have the arcade games, which are short, quick, and action-oriented. And that starts very early on, right? Breakout, I kind of expected to be able to go through both screens without dying once. Like, I know how to play Breakout. I can plan this stuff out. But no, the idea is that you're going to lose. But you're going to have so much fun that you want to put in another quarter. But they want you to put in the quarter as quickly as possible. So if you play a game like Asteroids and you're able to last like 5-10 minutes playing Asteroids, the game designers have failed. You lasted way too long in a quarter. That's costing people money. So arcades are designed around short, quick bursts of fun. Compared to arcade games, which are still, well, it's not arcade games, home console games, which are still basically trying to be arcade games, but they have longer bursts. We've only played one console game to this point, and that would be Adventure. And that game, you could play all the way through. And you would have fun all the way through. I don't know how much the replay value on that is. But the idea is still there that there's a difference between what is trying to get your money and what is trying to entertain you. that's hard to overlook. Then, of course, there's computer games, which are much more like console games in that they want to give you a longer experience. But with the computer games, it's much more slow and contemplative. And to see that difference so early on was surprising to me. I figured it would take time, that people would have very similar games on all three platforms. And although there, is ports of the arcade games onto the home consoles, there is still that huge difference between the three different platforms. And that was surprising for me to see. The last one is that games are harder than I'm used to. And that's still true. Colossal Cave Adventure, without a guide, I'm not sure I could have gotten through it. The regular adventure, I might have been able to do, but it would have been a struggle. Space Invaders, all the arcade games, they were difficult. And they are designed around getting quarters out of me as fast as possible. And without practicing a bit, I'm not sure I could have made 2 or 3 minutes on a quarter at all. So, yeah, and one of the things I did want to talk about is the high scores. I did mention them a few times. I don't know if I'm going to keep mentioning them as time goes on, but the thing that struck me was that in the 70s, the high scores were really all about endurance. They weren't about skill. You just had to have a certain skill level, and once you hit that, it didn't really matter how much better you got. It was just a matter of how long can you pay attention? How long can you stay awake? And that's how you get the high score in Space Invaders and Asteroids. It's just go and go and go, and not need to go to the bathroom, not need to eat, not need to sleep. That's what gives you a high score in those games. And that was weird. I figured that you needed a certain skill. You needed to have like the highest skill level. And I would say, no, you just need a certain skill level and a ton of endurance. And that was surprising to me. We're getting close to the end, I swear. There's just a couple more things I wanted to talk about. The first one that I talk about is something that we're going to kind of use a lot here. And we're going to do some awards. So let's talk about, once again, we're talking about the 70s as a whole here. So let's start with my favorite film. That's kind of, we're not going to say best film. We're going to say my favorite because I didn't watch all of them. We're only going to talk about the things that I've kind of delved into a little bit. So my favorite film, Star Wars. Alien was up there. It was close, don't get me wrong, but I'm a bigger fan of Star Wars. I think that's more because I'm not necessarily a horror fan. I kind of like the action of Star Wars. You can make a case for several other films, but for me, Star Wars. That was it. Favorite TV shows up next? For me, this was actually a little difficult because we didn't talk about too many TV shows. But of the ones that I've talked about, Monty Python's Flying Circus is my favorite. That's another one that I didn't come to until much, much later. I'm not sure I would have liked the show as a kid. It's weird. I tried to watch it as a teenager and I didn't like it. But now that I'm older, I do really appreciate the humor in Monty Python. So Monty Python's Flying Circus would be my favorite. Now that I think about it, is Monty Python and the Holy Grail my favorite movie? No, I'll still say Star Wars. Python's up there, though. Favorite computer? No surprises. The Apple II. I don't know how long we're going to keep the favorite computer category going, but the Apple II is really the only one with a solid gaming platform. Even though the game that we played was on the Atari computer systems, the Apple II is better as a computer itself than the Atari. Favorite console? No surprises, the Atari VCS. The Atari's good. It's the solid platform at the time. Nothing else really stacks up. We've talked about a lot of consoles. I haven't even named all of them. Just like, there were 500 that year. Let's move on. But the Atari VCS is definitely my favorite console of the bunch. And we will continue to monitor the favorite console probably forever. Let's see. What do we got next? Game that aged the worst. This, in my opinion, is kind of like the game that didn't hold up and probably suffers the worst from the modern review. And for me, that's Adventure. Adventure was fun. It looked it seemed good for the time, but by today's standards, to have half the manual be about glitches is not a good place to be. You don't want the game to explain lore-wise why it keeps breaking on you. So that would be probably the game that aged the worst for me. Next up is most disappointing game. This is the game that I had high hopes for, kind of going into. I needed to talk about it, but I probably had the least fun of all the games that we've played. And for me, that was Breakout. Breakout is good for the time. It's a single-player version, a version of Pong when that was desperately needed in the marketplace, but it just wasn't that fun for me to play overall. I still enjoyed it, don't get me wrong, but of the games that I played, it was the most disappointing to me. I don't want to say the worst game for the record, because I did not play the worst game of the 70s. I didn't play most of the games of the 70s, but this one was, of the ones I played, the most disappointing. Next up, we have most surprising game. Probably no surprises here. It probably surprised a lot of you guys as well. That would be Star Raiders and Colossal Cave Adventure. It's kind of a tie between the two of them. I didn't have high hopes for either one. I almost didn't play either one. And they turned out to be some of my favorites. So that's where I have to say they're surprising. Next up is favorite console game. That's Adventure, because it was the only console game that we played this year. Then we have favorite computer game. That's Star Raiders. I think that one was my favorite overall. It really kind of sucked me in and made me want to keep going in a way that a lot of the other games didn't. Favorite arcade game, Space Invaders. You could make the case for some of the later shooters, but for me, there was something so almost visceral about playing Space Invaders that made it a lot of fun. Then we have the favorite overall game. Once again, probably no surprises. That's going to be Star Raiders for me. You can easily make a case for Colossal Cave Adventure as well. But for me, I had a lot of fun playing Star Raiders, and it's the only game probably that we played in the 70s as a whole that I would consider going back to and trying a few more times. Maybe I'll go back to Colossal Cave Adventure to try to get that perfect score that kind of eluded me before, but that's not a huge thing for me. For me, trying to do the harder difficulties on Star Raiders is more appealing, but I'm still probably not going to do it. So then we have contributions from patrons. Yes, if you guys are not aware, I do have a Patreon, I should say. And I did put out a call for them to contribute to this video as well. If you guys are interested, check out the link in the description below. Maybe you want to join the Patreon and get a few benefits. There's just a couple right now, but this is one of them. So let's kind of go down the list here. We have Alex Jones. He's first. He said a lot, so we're going to go through this kind of quickly. I don't personally have any memories of games in the 70s, as this was before I was born. But from what I know, though, 70s was a big year for video games. At the beginning, they were virtually unknown, except for a few, and by the end, the video games industry was booming. Games were getting increasingly complex and were even in color towards the end of the decade. While they were still basic by today's standards, at the time, these must have been groundbreaking. Now, as for my favorite video game from the 70s, I think I'll have to give it to Colossal Cave Adventure. That game, despite having no graphics, had quite a complexity to it for the time. You have to go to different rooms, find objects, and use in the particular ways in order to proceed. It wasn't like the repetitive video games we had seen up to this point. My favorite movie from the 70s was definitely Star Wars. I love this franchise, and that's the movie that started it all. It had a real sense of excitement to it and changed the face of pop culture forever. As for my favorite TV show, that would be Doctor Who. Quite a big fan of that show, and I've seen most of the classic episodes aside from the Lost episodes. Just a side note here, I have watched all the original Doctor Who too. There are so many Lost episodes. BBC did not hold on to it, didn't think it was important, taped over the VHS tapes. Aside from that, though, I haven't seen any 70s shows. It seems like most of them are products of their day. They probably won't engage with today's audience as much. No, probably not. Doctor Who does hold up pretty well. if you go in just kind of expecting campiness. Just throwing it out there. We'll get to Doctor Who a little bit more later, actually. Now, as for what surprised me the most, it had to be the game Star Raiders. I was amazed that something this advanced was released this early. The fact that you moved about on a 3D plane of movement was just amazing for its time. Frankly, I've been surprised to see this anytime before the late 80s, so to get to see it released when we're still in the 70s is just something else. Overall, the 70s were the launching pad for video games. There were some big advances, but it was merely a prelude for what was to come. I've really enjoyed your series so far, and I look forward to future installments. Me too. Next up, we have Mike Lindgren. No personal memories of these games yet, although we are getting closer to what I grew up with. I really enjoyed Star Raiders. It looked super advanced for the time. I was surprised by how many Pong and Pong-like games were published during this time. I guess when you don't have many games to compare with, making minor changes seemed like a bigger deal than it does now. Absolutely. That was something that surprised me too. I didn't talk about that too much, but there were so many first-generation consoles that were basically just Pong. It was just Pong over and over and over again. They're like, well, it's Pong, but we put a little barricade in the middle that you have to go around. Therefore, it's a whole new game. You should buy a console with it. Like, no, I don't care. I didn't even talk about that too much, but I mean, there were 500 consoles. There were 500 different versions of Pong out there. All right. Last up, we have Joe Baymanesh. I think I'm saying that wrong. Do you have any personal D&D stories? Fortunately, no. I went through as much as I got. I would love to be able to do D&D at some point. Like I said, I have run role plays before. I'm typically the DM kind of person in that. But yeah, there was a time when I was on a forum and I was running role plays almost every night. So I have experience with that, but just not the Dungeons and Dragons part of it. So I never had to roll dice for damage or anything like that. Right, next question. Do you have a loose schedule for where you want to be chronologically? I think you said somewhere that you'd enter the 80s in 2021, but you've reached it earlier. I did reach it earlier. I did have the goal originally to get through the 70s by the end of 2020. I got through it a little bit sooner than that, by a few weeks, a little bit more than a month. So that made me happy. I was able to do that sooner than I anticipated. At the time that I set that goal, I believe I had everything scripted, or at least close to it, so it was easy to try to gauge, how long it was going to take me to get everything done. Right now, I don't have much scripted. I kind of wanted to stay in the mindset of the 70s for this video before I move too far into the 80s. I do have a couple videos done already, but I'm not entirely sure how long it's going to take. I'm not necessarily going to kind of predict that too much. Mostly because I'm not entirely sure how many of the games that I have on my list I'm actually going to be playing, or if I'm going to push them to the other video games list, kind of the honorable mentions list. Right now, though, I will say that I'm looking at double digits in games. That's the first time. There are more games in 1980 than there are in all of the 70s that I plan on playing. I believe that I will play most of them. So, we're going to move forward to it. So that's the other question. I also feel like the writing has gotten sharper and more concise as you've been producing more videos, so keep up the good work. It was a little bit harder at the beginning because everything was just so nebulous that it was hard to try to kind of focus. There was just, Manchester's doing this, and Atari's over here, and consoles are being released all across the world and all that kind of stuff. As we go on, it'll be easier for me to keep a through line of each individual story that we're following. I can follow Apple, I can follow Microsoft, I can follow Atari, I can follow consoles and stuff like that. So that's those are the contributions from Patreon. If you guys are interested, once again, link is in the description below. Let me find my list of patrons. I do want to thank you guys. So let's find the list here. Yes, that is the full list. All right, so I want to give out a shout out to all my patrons. As of recording this right now, those are Alex Jones. Special thank you to Veronica Gross, Trifkey989, thank you. Artie Skepti, thank you. Lymanity, thank you. Squirrel Dash, thank you. Daniel, thank you. Joe Bemanesh, thank you. James McDonald, thank you. And Mike Lindgren, thank you. So those are my patrons. Once again, if you want to join, link is in the description below. If you did like the videos, always subscribe is nice. Leaving a like, leaving comments. I am actually reading comments. I know for a while I had to stop because I was so focused on getting the videos done, but pick that back up. So I am reading those again. Feel free to leave the comments. I don't always respond. I haven't been responding much lately, but I do read them. So they are nice to get. All right, so with that said, let's do one last thing, and let's look forward to our next kind of, year. That's what it's going to be. It's going to be a year. I was thinking like our next little time period, but from this point forward, we're going to be doing a video like this every year. I'll try to keep them a lot shorter. I went so long that I ran through a battery and I filled up the SD card. So I'm going to try to keep them shorter from now on. I'll try to keep them under an hour. But this one, it's a big deal. So it's going to be longer. We had to talk about a lot of things. So looking ahead, that's what I wanted to talk about. I ramble a bit when I just am in front of the camera. So let's talk about looking forward to the year 1980. Of course, it's going to be different. The 80s are going to be different. Video games are taking off in 1980. We kind of saw that trend a bit. In 1972, we played one game. In 1976, we played 2 games. There was nothing in between those. 1978, we played 1 game. I believe it was just the 1 game. Unless I'm missing something that I keep forgetting. But no, I'm pretty sure 1978 it was just Space Invaders. But we skipped to 1977. 1977 was the last year that we would not play a game. I don't think we even did honorable mentions. There just wasn't any games in 1977 I felt that were worth talking about. Unless you wanted to count Colossal Cave Adventure, but I talked about it in 1976. I figured that was the year for it. 1979, we played 4 games. In 1980, we will play more games than all of the 70s combined. We played 8 games in the 70s. In 1980, we'll be playing more than 8 games just in the year 1980. Things start taking off, and we will play, I believe, more games year to year from this point forward until we start reaching a cap somewhere. But I believe that in 1980, that'll be the start of just this upward progress in number of good video games to play. And that trend will continue, and I'm looking forward to that. I should mention that of the games, I don't want to give away too much here and do too much behind the scenes of what's going to come. But we will be playing games from new developers. It's not just going to be Atari. And that is something that excites me. Even though we played a couple other games that didn't come out by Atari in the 70s, it was mostly Atari games. And I'm looking forward to seeing some other people's perspectives on what a video game should be. And that means in 1980, we're going to see some new perspectives. And that is something that I look forward to seeing. And that's exciting. So look forward to that. 1980, some new people coming out. Also in 1980, we have a big film release coming out. No surprises as what that's going to be. If you know what came out in 1980, it's going to be that one. Yeah, we're going to talk about it. We're going to go into detail about that. There's not much else to look forward to. There's just going to be more video games from some new people, and there's a big film. So that is what 1980 is going to be. I'm not sure when we're going to finish out 1980 right now, but I plan on trying to keep the schedule that I've had going consistent as as kind of long as I can. If I can get things done faster, I will upload them faster. If I can't and it ends up being slower, then I'll upload things slower. But I look forward to seeing you guys in 1980. My name has been Baller Scuba. This has been Video Games Over Time. This has been a retrospective of the 70s. It has lasted a long time. If you made it all the way through, I thank you. I didn't think that it was going to take this long. I figured about an hour. I think I am well over that now. But this has been fun. It's been a long time since I've just kind of sat down and talked about how things are going when it comes to the channel. But I am happy that the project is well underway and that things seem to be going well. If you like it, leave a like. If you have something to comment, leave a comment. Subscribing is always nice. I'm not sure how much it helps, but it's nice. I don't care about the bell at all. If you care about the bell, feel free to hit the bell. But most importantly, I would say feel free to share it with your friends. This is something that I want there to be conversations about. So if you know somebody that might be interested in some of this stuff, feel free to share it with them. And hopefully we can start growing the audience that way. That would be ideal, more than the likes or the subscriptions. Just tell people that you know. Either your online friends, in-person friends. Hey, have you ever heard of Colossal Cave Adventure? Have you ever heard of Star Raiders? Probably not. It's actually really good. You should check it out. That kind of thing means so much more to me than any of the YouTube algorithm stuff. So that would be the best way to support the channel, in my mind. If you want to do it financially, Patreon is there. For $1, you can go there. And for a minimum of $1, you can do as much as you want. If you do too much, I might ask you if you're okay. But you can do what you want on Patreon. And that will also help financially support the channel. So that is our 70s retrospective. I apparently can't end the video to save my life, but I hope you guys have laughed. I hope you have learned. And I hope to see you next time in 1980. Thanks for watching.